Wow, this is great. Wonderful to see all of you here. I'm glad that you all could come. Konkona, welcome to the Bay Area.
Thank you.
Let's give a big round of applause.
Thank you.
This is Konkona's first visit to the Bay Area, is that correct?
Yes, I think it is, yes.
Yes. So we hope that you have a great time here. Thank you for spending this evening with us. And I wanted to just say, I'm personally so thrilled to be having this conversation with you because I have followed your work so closely for the last 2 decades. I have just so admired the roles that you've played, and I've been so inspired by the kinds of films that you've done and the issues that you have addressed. So it's truly a pleasure for me.
Thank you.
Konkona, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about the family you grew up in. Of course, I think everyone here knows you really grew up surrounded by film, theater, poetry, literature. Your mother is, of course, award-winning director and actor Aparna Sen. Your father was a writer and journalist. Did you always know that you wanted to be in this field? Did you always know you wanted to do film? Or did you want to do something completely different when you were young?
So I never wanted to be an actor or a director. I think it's because I saw the gritty back end of things. So it's true that I grew up, I had a fairly unconventional childhood, I would say, compared to many people, many of my friends. We grew up with, even though I had a wonderful relationship with my father, I grew up primarily with a single working mother and her host and her sorority, and always saw my mother, playing various roles, not just acting, but also as the editor of a women's magazine, and as a film director, as a writer, and I grew up with when I was growing up. So my mother was a film actress, a fairly mainstream film actor. But in the years that I was growing up, she had kind of shifted to direction. So and the films that she directed, unlike the films that she acted in, were were quite unconventional. They were not the mainstream kind of films. And I guess I saw the struggle to put out something that is not popular, that is not conventional. It's very hard to get funding also. But what was lovely is that I grew up seeing a lot of that going on at home. For example, budget meetings, production meetings. And because I was very small and I would be in and out of the room, sometimes I would also play along. So I remember one of her assistants would sit with me on the side and I would be making my own budget for my own, imaginary film. I remember as a kid playing a game with my mother. Like, I think it was the one odd day when she had an afternoon off, and I would say, okay, now you play with me. And she'd be like, okay, but can I play lying down? So I said, okay. Then, you're the actress, and I'm the director. And I want you to do a scene where you're very sleepy and you're lying down, and then you have to get up and switch off the light and then go back to sleep. And I said, at that time we would say start, sound, camera, and action. And I said all of that, and then she started doing it, and I immediately said, cut, 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 cut. And I must have been, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 or something. And she said, why? What do you mean cut? I did it fine. It was very simple. And so I was like, no, you're very sleepy. You can't just get up and put off the lights. You have to do it in a sleepy way. Games like that were played. The other thing is that because my grandfather, Chidananda Dasgupta, was a film historian and a filmmaker, and he also co-founded the Calcutta Film Society along with Satyajit Ray. And I think my parents, my mother, as well as me and my sister, we grew up in an environment where we were encouraged to watch a lot of world cinema, a lot of regional cinema. In fact, I was not allowed to, as a kid, watch, the mainstream Hindi cinema of the 80s and 90s. So I didn't really grow up watching that. Even, for example, so she was quite particular about the things that I was exposed to. And I guess I was fairly obedient, unlike my older sister. And for example, she also did not want me to watch the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which was the televised series at the time, which was so popular, I guess, in the early 90s, or was it late 80s or something. And of course, I snuck in an episode here and there at a friend's house, but by and large, I didn't grow up watching that because she said that she didn't want my first impression of these epics to be in the form of a fairly tacky television production. And she had wanted me to read it. Of course, I didn't read it till many, many years later. I still haven't read the Ramayana completely. Um, so, that's the kind of thing that she was very particular about. Or even when I think my sister, when we were reading a lot of Enid Blyton, she would say, that's it, now you have to stop reading Enid Blytons and don't read Archies and things like that. Read some proper books. So she was, and I don't think I've been that successful with my son. But she was very particular, and I think that stood me in great stead. Because what happens is that when you grow up with then that becomes a default. And I know that I'm just jumping ahead because of things that we were talking about, like things like you know what are the main things, the main factors of, say, a commercial Hindi film become the default for many people, but it wasn't for me. So that's a great advantage. Even in performances and acting, that happens because what you see from a young age, you imbibe. But because I hadn't watched that and I was watching all kinds of different films, I think I was able to do something which is different. And growing up, I didn't ever identify with the mainstream Hindi film industry or the mainstream Bengali film industry. I didn't really identify with it. I didn't see myself there. I didn't see people who looked like me. And I didn't relate to the kind of aesthetics or often the kinds of values which were fairly regressive sometimes. I didn't relate to that at all, so I didn't see a space for myself there, which is probably, and also that I saw the back end of things, which was often very much of a struggle. So I think for these reasons, very long-winded answer, that I didn't actually think that I would ever become an actor or a director.
Well, and that's so fascinating to hear you say that, because you said that you saw kind of the reality in some ways, right? I think a lot of people say it looks very glamorous. They see, the audience sees what they see, but they don't know the behind the scenes, and you really had that. So it's very interesting that you decided to go into the films. And actually, I want to, it brings kind of the next question, which is to talk about, your 2003 Mr. and Mrs. Iyer. I think for many of us, certainly for me, that was really an introduction to you and your work. And, unfortunately, because we're outside, we're not able to show any clips. I really wanted to show the clip from sort of the end of the film, which, there's so many moments in that film, which is so poignant. It was such a pleasure. I was telling you, I rewatched it, and I was thinking, it still is so impactful. But the end scene
And
is
relevant.
and relevant. Oh, absolutely relevant. Absolutely relevant. But so thinking about this film, of course, you won the national award for your portrayal of Meenakshi Iyer, and you have said that this film was really sort of pivotal for you in your career. Tell us a little bit about that, and were you also like pleasantly surprised with the success of the film?
So again, I didn't want to do the film because I thought that my mom should be casting actually a Tam Bram person, and in fact I suggested Samira Reddy, not Samira Reddy, her older sister. Anyway, the Reddy, one of the Reddy sisters, because I said, at that time as I said, I didn't want to be an actor. I had already done 2 films, but I still didn't want to be an actor. While I was in college, I was offered a Bengali film by a lovely man called Konkona Sen, but the film was not great. It was the copy of a very B-grade Hollywood film called The Crush, which had Alicia Silverstone. And it was a copy of that film, and I was in college and I was doing English honors, and we were studying theatre of the absurd, and I was just like, please, this is so silly. But it was in the summer vacations between my second and my third year in college, and I just did it as a lark. I didn't think it would ever come out, and then it did, and then it was quite popular. I won some regional awards, and then Rituparna Ghosh, who was a very close family friend, he wanted me to do Titli. So, and my mom was acting in the film, so we did that, and, it was more like a family vacation in the hills. So, I didn't take any of that very seriously, and then my mom was writing Mr. and Mrs. Iyer, and at that time I remember the desktop computer used to be in my bedroom, and she would sit and write, and she would often read aloud things to me, and she says that from my expressions while she was reading aloud, she thought that I should play Meenakshi Iyer, and I was just like, no, don't be silly. I mean, certainly you can't take me. And she was very smart because she sent me to Chennai to do some research for her. Actually, she just kind of, threw me into the culture, and I guess I imbibed a lot from that. And she wanted me to do research, like, about the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites and the difference between the Ayers and the Iyengars and the name. Like, originally the child's name was going to be Murugan, but I said, no, that's not an Iyer name. I came back with, and I said, no, we'll have, and I gave her a list of options. So I really enjoyed that very much. And hanging out with some Tamil mamis in the temples and things like that. I really enjoyed that very much. And we had some family friends whom I lived with in Madras. So I came back really immersed in that culture. I think I was there for, I don't know, maybe a week or 10 days. And and then I said, okay, yeah, let's do it. I was doing an MA in Delhi University at the time, and it was very boring because I had already done my A levels and I had already done my English honors, and we were doing that same, that Chaucer, Donne, Milton all over again. And one day in the MA class, she said, what is the difference between a simile and a metaphor? And I said, forget it. This is just too boring. And so I dropped my MA, and and also the building is very ugly. Yeah. So then I did Mr. and Mrs. Iyer, and I just did it as a lark again. And I remember even after the film released, looking at the classifieds in the paper, looking for jobs, and even going for some job interviews. But then I won the national award. And that's why I say it was a turning point in that sense, because what happened is that I got a lot of attention nationally. So I started getting offers for scripts, and the thing is, I hadn't ever been a very ambitious person, so it's not like I knew that, oh no, actually this is what I want to do. I had no idea, and really zero skills and or training in anything. I had done English honors. I thought I would get a job in something shallow and urban, like advertising, or that's actually a line from English, August. Anyway, so then and then I started getting some interesting offers, so I just went along with it. And then I did films like Page 3 and Amu, and I kept thinking, I'm going to get a real job. I'm going to get a real job down the line. I'll figure out what to do. And then eventually one day I was just like, what, I have to accept that this is what I do. And the gratitude and the enjoyment actually came much later.
Oh, I was just going to ask, did you actually enjoy while you were filming for that, or no? You were saying no.
I enjoyed Mr. and Mrs. Iyer a lot, but the early years of filming I didn't enjoy as much, because often there were films that didn't really resonate with me completely. And there were times, but I also think it's important to do things that you don't enjoy. It's, in the sense of character building, I guess, or life lessons. So what it really helped me in learning to detach. Because many times in my early films, I used to be like, oh, what are they doing? What is the set decoration? Why have they done this like this? Oh, it's awful. Sometimes I would be like that, but I learned to detach. And that's a really useful life lesson to, in the midst of chaos, to be able to focus on what you're doing and to just let go of something. So eventually, yeah, I was grateful for it.
So your mother, or Purnashen, she directed you in Mr. and Mrs. Iyer. And you said in an interview, acting in Mr. and Mrs. Iyer was a unique experience. It was the first time that my mother was directing me in a lead role. I could have never done it without her. And then, of course, in 2021, most recently, she directed you in the film The Rapist. So how has your professional relationship with your mother changed now that you have, of course, matured as an actor and as a filmmaker and as a director? And can you tell us some, behind the scenes, like what happens if you totally disagree with something she says? Is it mom or is it director? Like how do you kind of navigate that?
So I think like in Mr. and Mrs. I couldn't have done it without her, why I said, is because she really knew how to train me, because I've had no formal training. Mm-hmm. So for example, sending me to Madras, or the workshops that we did very detailed, and in those days nobody did. Nowadays we still do some film workshops, we still do look tests for the character and things like that, but we never did that back then. And also she would continuously talk to me in that Tamil accented English, continuously, whether we would like shopping or eating or whatever, just at home.
Total immersion.
Total immersion, so I had no choice. And because I was a little awkward and shy, I've always been a bit shy, and I didn't want to kind of just start talking like that and making mistakes and feeling silly, but she was always talking to me like that, so it became very normal. And the parents that she cast for me were also family friends who are also helping me with, the accent and the lines. So in that sense, it became easy for me because it's not like I had any, I knew how to prepare or anything. Which is why I think she played a pivotal role. Since then, I've done at least 6 or 7 films that she's directed, I think. And I don't know what she would say. I mean, she might have many complaints. I don't really. I like to, nowadays what's happened is I like to tease her a little. And it's really not fair. Poor thing is so stressed, and I know that directors can be stressed, but many times while she's directing, and I know she can see me on the monitor, and I'll say things, I'll make faces at her, I'll say I'm very hungry, and she'll be like, cook. So but I think I might hassle her a little bit, but it's well-meaning.
That's great, and I love hearing that. So, Konkona, you have said, I'm going to read this quote, and as it's getting a little darker and darker, I'm worried I'm not going to be able to read everything on my sheet here. But I love, so this is, you've said, I love playing angry women. I feel it's a way of giving voice to my inner rage, but I also like characters who are gray. I love playing characters who are going through some kind of transition. Characters who start off in a certain way and then go on to change. So, I really love that quote because I think for women, and particularly South Asian women, we often don't give ourselves permission to be angry, right? And I think with so many of your characters, you've sort of given a voice to our rage in some sense. And, and through your characters, we can sort of, challenge social norms like you've done in these films. So, can you tell us who has been your favorite sort of angry woman to play? And is there a particular type of character, fictional or a real life character that you hope to one day play in film?
So, it is, especially in the early part of my career, I was always playing, a very morally upright woman whose integrity cannot be. I seem to exude integrity. I don't know how or why. And actually, I'm quite a shady character. But I seem to, come across this, like virtuous or something. So I was tired and bored of that myself. But in the later part of my career, I have, gotten much more interesting roles like in Dolly Kitty or Gili Pucci and several others. So that's the thing, we rarely allow women not just to be angry, but to just be, morally irresponsible. We very rarely show bad mothers who are also, likable or relatable characters. And that's so limiting. So I was always looking for those kind of characters, looking for, just because that's not how, women are in real life. And not that women are any one particular kind of way, but the way they're depicted in films, in those early years, those early films, whether it's Wake Up Sid or Metro or, several films from that time, I was always playing that kind of a part. But I think later I have played, for example, in Dolly Kitty, I play a character who's cheating on her husband. She is not always a very good mother. She also goes through a period of transition, like Mrs. Iyer, in fact, who overcomes some of her prejudices. And it's interesting to go through some kind of transformation, which even in real life, I don't know how much we allow ourselves that kind of that kind of transformation, because it's nice to be able to change your mind and evolve and, understand and learn new things and not be accused of being inconsistent. So I like to see that in the films. It's not like I'm actively looking out for those kind of things when I'm looking for a role. Usually I'm just trying to see what the script is like, whether I'm interested in reading in the script, and if it can just like, if it's an interesting script to read, and mostly they're not, and a badly written script is very hard to read because it's not a well-told story. And a well-written script and well-defined characters make your job much easier because a lot of that work and characterization is already done for you on paper. So that's why I'm always looking for roles like that, and that's why when I directed Love Stories, The Mirror, there is a scene, between the employer and the employee, played fabulously by Tilottama Shom and Amrita Subhash, where they're fighting with each other. And I enjoyed that so much. And I think they enjoyed it so much because they're actually just screaming at each other, and sometimes rage is masking something else.
Yeah.
And and it's nice when emotions are nuanced and you don't know. Often rage is just grief or anger or shame, and And those kind of things are interesting to explore.
Well, so you mentioned, your role Dolly and then directing Love Story. So, I mean, I wanted to really explore the idea of changing the narrative because, that's the theme of this Sala Festival. And I mean, you've certainly done that on so many issues. And just thinking about, your sort of how you've pushed the narrative or changed our perception around issues of female desire, who is allowed to feel desire, who isn't, looking at sexuality from a female gaze, even addressing issues of shame. These are often not addressed, certainly not in the South Asian context. So these and other issues, how have you used your role as an actor and as a filmmaker to kind of push the, agenda on these issues? And what other issues do you think you would like to take on in your future projects?
So I'm usually not actively pursuing issues, and often in a work that I'm writing, which is not often, it's only Death in the Ganjan Mirror, the film reveals itself to you, and you are revealed to yourself in what you're writing also. It's not like I thought that I want to make a film about desire or I want to change the narrative. But I guess in one sense, because of my mom and because of my upbringing, for me the male gaze wasn't the default. So that's not how I saw the world anyway. The how I saw the world is what comes through in perhaps the films that I wrote, not necessarily even the films that I acted in. Um, so, and the thing about taking space is so interesting because it's so the kinds of bodies that are allowed to take space, the kinds of bodies that are allowed to desire are very limited, at least in the kinds of films that are popular. So invariably, I've said this earlier as well, invariably they're young and fair and thin, uh, and things like that, So you don't, and that's a very limited way of looking at desire. And that's also not very interesting then because it's also being done to death. In Mirror, I wanted to, actually, I didn't want to get into the morality of it because, I mean, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but it's about this woman who watches someone else who enjoys being watched, but they can't come to terms with it.
And of course, there's the class issue
There
that
is,
comes
yes,
there.
exactly, exactly. And space is such an issue in big cities, especially in Mumbai, and the relationship that we have, between the classes is very, it's a very limited kind of a space which doesn't, it's just codified and how you can interact. Like for example, you could, give your house to your friend for them to, have sex, but you would not want to, you would not want someone who is not of your social class to do that. I mean, of course, there is the question of consent, which also comes through in the character of the man. But so that I just wanted to examine those kinds of things because the relationship between the employer and the employee in a domestic space is very intimate. And I wanted to say lines like that. I guess here it's not that much of an issue, but because there's not so much, of domestic workers here, I guess, I'm not sure. But it's so much the case in Bombay and in India. Because as the character says, the line she says is "Teri chaddi tak to main dhoti hai."
That's a great line.
And we actually see it visually as well. And yet, Tilottama, the employer, says, "Ghin aati hai mujhe soch ke bhi." And the thing is that she can very easily start saying these things because those are what is socially acceptable. So when they catch each other, because I always like to describe them as thieves who are stealing pleasure from each other. If you don't get into the morality of it, who's right? But they both transgress. They've both done something wrong, But when they come face to face, they are actually performing an outrage for the sake of the husband who is a stand-in for the rest of society. And also perhaps for themselves, because it's very hard to accept these things about ourselves, because we may have certain things within ourselves that we're ashamed of. And so they're performing this outrage and they're accusing each other. And actually that's not, it's not anger, it's shame. And it's probably some level of grief of not being able to say, yes, because you knew I was watching you, I enjoyed watching you, I enjoyed being watched. They don't have the vocabulary
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah.
And it's also hard to find that because there's also a language, partly a language barrier as well. So they're
Yeah.
unable to address each other like that. So it's very easy to slip into what is acceptable. And what is socially acceptable may not always be the most just or the most fair thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I love that line also that you quoted because it really speaks to the intimacy that's kind of inherent in the relationship already. Yeah, so she's sort of bringing that up that, how intimate it is. And also you sort of turn on its head the idea of consent because the man in this situation, no one really took his consent, and he brings that up. I mean, that's also a very powerful scene where he's talking to his wife and sort of,
That's why we actually, in the first draft wrote it and then realized, oh no, we haven't, we haven't actually, accounted for the man. And that's a terrible thing. And the thing is, had it been a woman, it would have been, a much
Very
bigger
different.
deal, because when we speak of consent, often we're thinking of women and not of men, but actually it's just it's the concept itself, of course. So in that sense, I feel like the man in the film is the moral conscience of the film, and I wanted to show that they have a good marriage. It's not, and also what are the realities, because we're speaking of space. And that's why the decision to enter the film with the employer, who's of a higher social stature, so to speak. Because the viewers who are watching it on Netflix are mainly from her, strata of society. And from there, we move into the domestic worker space. And as soon as you see the space, there are 9 people in the room. And the thing is, we already know all of this. We already know it, but it's very convenient to forget.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you don't see it on screen.
We rarely see it on screen. We often see it in an exploitative way.
Yeah, exactly. And just the final sort of thought and question, well, first of all, congratulations. The Mumbai Diaries Season 2 just released yesterday, in fact. And so tell us what's next for you. What are you working on and what's next? What do we have to look forward to?
So, Mumbai Diaries, this is the 2nd season. It's the first time I've ever done a sequel. I've never done a sequel, but that was quite, fun. It's like a homecoming of sorts. There's also, so that's on Amazon, and then there's a show called Soup, Killer Soup, which has been directed by Abhishek Chaubey. It's a web series where I'm playing kind of a grey character that I'm very excited about. It's with Manoj Bajpayee. He and I have both been in the industry for so many years and we've never worked together. And I've been a big fan of Abhishek Chaubey, so I'm very excited that's releasing on Netflix in January. Other than that, there is my mother Aparna Sen's film, The Rapist, which is playing at MAMI, the Mumbai Film Festival in October. And as in my intro mentioned, I'm also doing Anurag Basu's Metro, which is a spiritual sequel to the old Metro.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Konkona. It was just fantastic, being in conversation with you.
Thank
and
you.
I think we have some time for